The silver moonlight danced across the empty Wyoming plains as Margaret Jameson clutched her medical bag tighter, the midnight breeze carrying the distant sound of a baby's wail through the darkness. She hadn't expected to find anything out here, 3 miles from town, when she'd heard what sounded like crying while returning from a difficult birth at the Wilson homestead. Yet there it was, a small cabin with a flicker of lantern light, the cries growing louder as she approached. Wyoming Territory, 1879. This wasn't the life Margaret had planned. At 26, she'd expected to be married with children of her own by now, not working as the only midwife in the small frontier town of Rivers Bend. But fate had different ideas when her fiancé died of influenza 3 years ago, leaving her to forge a different path. The crying intensified as she dismounted her horse, tying it to the hitching post. The door to the cabin hung slightly ajar, and Margaret hesitated. Folks in these parts weren't always welcoming to strangers, especially after dark. But that was definitely a baby crying, and she couldn't simply ride away. "Hello," she called, knocking gently on the weathered door. "Is everything all right in there?" When no answer came except the continued wailing, Margaret pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The cabin was sparsely furnished but clean, with a small fire dying in the hearth. And there, pacing the wooden floor with a red-faced, screaming infant in his arms, was a man she'd never seen before. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark blonde hair falling across his forehead, he looked up at her with the most desperate blue eyes she'd ever seen. His clothes were rumpled, stubble darkened his jaw, and there were shadows of exhaustion beneath his eyes. "I don't know what to do," he whispered, his voice cracking as he gently bounced the crying baby. "She won't stop crying. She won't eat. I don't know what to do." Margaret set her bag down and moved toward him without hesitation. "I'm Margaret Jameson, the midwife from Rivers Bend." "May I?" she asked, holding out her arms. He looked at her with such profound relief that it made her heart ache. "Yates Turner," he said, carefully transferring the tiny bundle to her arms. "This is Emma. She's 4 months old and she's been crying for hours." Margaret cradled the infant against her chest, her practiced hands already assessing. The baby was warm, too warm. "How long has she had the fever?" she asked, moving to the small table where she could lay the child down and examine her properly. "Fever?" Yates looked stricken. I didn't know she had a fever. My wife, she always knew what to do. But she's..." His voice broke. "She passed 3 days ago. Pneumonia. It was so fast." Margaret's heart sank as she understood the full picture. A widower, alone with an infant, with no idea how to care for her. She unwrapped the baby's blanket, noting the flushed skin and the slight rash across her chest. "She has a mild fever and a rash. Has she been nursing? Or taking a bottle?" "My wife was nursing her. I've been trying to give her cow's milk, but she won't take it." His hands trembled slightly as he ran them through his hair. "The milk might be upsetting her stomach." Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out several packets. "We need to get this fever down and then figure out what she can eat." For the next hour, Margaret worked to soothe the infant. She prepared a weak tea with herbs that would help reduce the fever and ease any stomach discomfort, administering it drop by drop with a small spoon. She showed Yates how to dilute the cow's milk properly and add a bit of sugar to make it more palatable for the baby. By the time Emma finally fell asleep, exhausted from her ordeal, the sky outside had begun to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Margaret gently placed the sleeping infant in the simple wooden cradle near the fireplace. "She should sleep for a while now," Margaret said softly, turning to find Yates watching her with an expression of wonder and gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "If you hadn't come along..." "You would have figured something out," Margaret assured him, though she wasn't entirely certain that was true. "Do you have family nearby who can help?" He shook his head. "No, Claire and I came out here from Boston 2 years ago. Her parents disowned her for marrying me. I was just a ranch hand back east. Not good enough for their daughter. My folks died years ago. What will you do now? Margaret asked, packing her supplies back into her bag. Yates looked at his sleeping daughter with a mixture of love and fear. Keep going, I suppose. I've got 80 acres and some cattle. Claire and I were building something here. I can't give up on that. But the baby, I'll figure it out. His jaw set with determination, though his eyes revealed his uncertainty. Margaret hesitated, knowing she should return to town but reluctant to leave this man and his child alone. I could come back tomorrow, she offered. Check on Emma and bring some supplies. Show you how to care for her. The relief in his eyes was immediate and profound. I would be grateful beyond words, Miss Jameson. Margaret, she corrected him with a small smile. If I'm going to be teaching you how to care for your daughter, we might as well use first names. Margaret, he repeated, and something in the way he said it made her heart beat a little faster. Thank you. As Margaret rode back to town in the early morning light, she found herself thinking about Yates Turner and his daughter. In her 3 years as a midwife, she'd seen plenty of tragedy, but something about this particular situation tugged at her heart. Perhaps it was the helplessness in his eyes, or the gentle way he'd held his daughter despite his fear. Or perhaps it was simply that she recognized in him the same grief she'd carried since losing her own chance at family happiness. Whatever the reason, as the town of Riversbend came into view, Margaret knew with certainty that she would be making that 3-mile ride out to the Turner homestead regularly from now on. True to her word, Margaret returned the next day with supplies. She'd spent the morning gathering what she thought Yates might need: goat's milk, which would be gentler on Emma's stomach than cow's milk, clean cloths for diapers, salve for the rash, and a book on infant care she'd ordered months ago, but hadn't yet had occasion to lend out. When she arrived at the cabin, she found Yates outside, chopping wood with fierce intensity, while Emma lay in her cradle on the porch, awake but quiet. "How is she today?" Margaret called as she dismounted. Yates set down the axe and wiped sweat from his brow. "Better, thanks to you. She took some milk this morning and slept most of the night." "That's wonderful," Margaret said, moving to check on the baby. Emma looked up at her with curious blue eyes, her father's eyes, and Margaret felt a smile spread across her face. "Hello there, little one. You're looking much better today." "Can I offer you some coffee?" Yates asked, gesturing toward the cabin. "It's the least I can do." Over coffee? Margaret explained the supplies she'd brought and began teaching Yates the basics of caring for an infant. She showed him how to test the temperature of the milk, how to hold Emma while feeding her, how to change her diaper properly, and how to bathe her. "Claire made it all look so easy," Yates said, his expression a mixture of concentration and sadness as he awkwardly fastened a clean diaper. "I never paid enough attention. I was always too busy with the ranch." "You're doing fine," Margaret assured him. "Every parent has to learn these things. Some just learn earlier than others." "Were you married before?" Yates asked suddenly, then looked immediately apologetic. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." Margaret shook her head. "No, it's all right. I was engaged once to a man named Thomas. He died before we could marry." "Influenza." Yates's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry." "It was 3 years ago, but I understand grief," she said quietly. "It doesn't go away, but it does change, becomes something you can carry." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, united in their understanding of loss. "I should show you how to prepare the goat's milk," Margaret said finally, rising from her chair. "It's different from cow's milk." By the time Margaret prepared to leave that afternoon, Emma was sleeping peacefully, and Yates seemed less overwhelmed. He walked Margaret to her horse, his expression thoughtful. "Would it be an imposition if I asked you to come again?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "I'll pay you for your time, of course." "No payment necessary," Margaret said quickly. I'd be happy to check on Emma again. Perhaps in 2 days? That would give you time to practice what I've shown you. Relief washed over his face. That would be perfect. Thank you, Margaret. I don't know what Emma and I would do without your help. As spring warmed into summer, Margaret's visits to the Turner homestead became a regular occurrence. What started as twice-weekly check-ins soon became every other day visits, and not all of them strictly necessary for Emma's well-being. The baby was thriving under her father's care, growing stronger and more alert with each passing week. Yates, too, was changing. The desperate, grief-stricken man she'd first encountered was giving way to a competent, devoted father. He still had moments of doubt and sadness, but he'd learned to soothe his daughter's cries, to anticipate her needs, to find joy in her development. And Margaret found herself looking forward to her visits more than she cared to admit. She told herself it was professional concern for the baby, or perhaps sympathy for a man struggling with single parenthood. But she knew those weren't the only reasons her heart quickened as she approached the Turner cabin, or why she took extra care with her appearance before each visit. One warm July evening, as Margaret prepared to leave after spending the afternoon helping Yates plant a small vegetable garden behind the cabin, he surprised her with an invitation. "The town's having its Independence Day celebration next week," he said, brushing dirt from his hands as they stood by her horse. "I was thinking of taking Emma into town for it. It would be her first real outing, and I thought—" He hesitated, then continued more quickly. "I thought you might like to join us, as a thank you for all your help." Margaret felt a flutter of pleasure at the invitation. "I'd like that very much," she said, then added with a small smile, "though I was planning to be at the celebration anyway, since I live in town." Yates looked slightly abashed. "Of course you would be. I just meant we could attend together, if you wanted." "I would like that," Margaret repeated, more softly this time. The day of the celebration dawned bright and clear. Margaret spent more time than usual preparing, selecting her best blue dress and pinning her dark hair up in a style she rarely bothered with for everyday work. It was just a town celebration, she told herself, not a proper outing. But the flutter in her stomach suggested otherwise. She met Yates and Emma at the edge of town, where he'd tied up his wagon. Emma, now nearly 6 months old, was dressed in a white gown that Margaret recognized as one she'd helped Yates alter from one of his late wife's nightdresses. The baby gurgled happily at the sight of Margaret, reaching out with chubby hands. "She's excited to see you," Yates said, his smile warming his blue eyes. He looked different today, clean-shaven, his blonde hair neatly combed, wearing a crisp white shirt she'd never seen before. "You look lovely, Margaret." The simple compliment brought heat to her cheeks. "Thank you. You both look very nice as well." The town square was decorated with red, white, and blue bunting, and tables had been set up for a community picnic. Children ran about with sparklers, and a small band was setting up for dancing later in the evening. As they walked together, Margaret was acutely aware of the glances they received. Rivers Bend was a small town, and gossip traveled fast. She knew people would talk about her spending the day with the widower Turner and his baby. But for once, Margaret found she didn't care. They spent the afternoon enjoying the festivities. Yates proudly showed Emma off to the townspeople, many of whom were meeting her for the first time. Margaret introduced him to people she knew, and they shared a picnic lunch in the shade of a large oak tree. "I haven't been to town since Claire died," Yates admitted as they watched the band setting up. "Wasn't sure how I'd be received, being a stranger still." "You're hardly a stranger after nearly 2 years," Margaret pointed out, "and people respect a man who takes good care of his child." "Only because you showed me how," he said, his gaze warm as it rested on her face. When the dancing began, Yates surprised her again. "Would you care to dance?" he asked, nodding toward Mrs. Patterson, the baker's wife, who was holding Emma and cooing to her. "Are you sure?" Margaret asked, glancing at his daughter. Mrs. Patterson offered to watch her for one dance, and I'd very much like to dance with you, Margaret. His hand was warm and steady as he led her to the area cleared for dancing. The band struck up a lively tune, and Margaret found herself laughing as Yates proved to be a better dancer than she'd expected. "Where did you learn to dance like this?" she asked as he twirled her. "Claire insisted on teaching me. Said she wouldn't have a husband who couldn't dance properly at socials." His expression flickered with sadness at the mention of his wife. But the sorrow didn't linger as it once had. When the music slowed to a waltz, Yates drew her a little closer, his hand respectful at her waist, but his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I've been thinking," he said quietly as they moved to the music. "Emma needs more than just me. She needs a woman's influence, a mother's guidance." Margaret's heart stuttered in her chest. "Yates." "I'm not asking anything of you," he quickly assured her. "I know it's too soon, for both of us. I just wanted you to know that I've been thinking about the future, about what Emma needs, about what I might want someday." Before Margaret could respond, the music ended, and they were rejoining Mrs. Patterson and Emma, but his words stayed with her throughout the evening, filling her with a mixture of hope and uncertainty that made it difficult to concentrate on the rest of the celebration. As the sun began to set and the fireworks were prepared, Yates found a spot for them on a blanket at the edge of the gathering. Emma had fallen asleep against his shoulder, exhausted from the excitement of the day. "She's had a wonderful time," Margaret said, gently stroking the baby's soft cheek. "We both have," Yates replied, his voice low. "Thank you for joining us today." The first fireworks exploded overhead, casting colorful light across his face. In that moment, with the baby sleeping between them and the night sky bursting with light, Margaret allowed herself to imagine a future she hadn't dared consider since Thomas died. The summer progressed with a rhythm that became familiar and cherished. Margaret continued her visits to the Turner homestead, but they gradually shifted from medical necessity to something else entirely. She began staying for supper, helping Yates prepare simple meals and teaching him recipes that would be nourishing for both him and Emma as she began to eat solid foods. Yates, in turn, showed Margaret the ranch he was building. He took her riding across his land, pointing out the improvements he'd made and the plans he had for expansion. He was a good rancher, she realized, with a natural understanding of the land and livestock. The small herd of cattle he'd started with was growing, and he spoke of adding horses next year. Emma continued to thrive, sitting up on her own now and beginning to crawl. She lit up whenever Margaret arrived, reaching for her with eager arms and babbling happily. And Margaret, who had always loved children but assumed she would never have any of her own, found herself falling deeply in love with the little girl, and with her father, though that was a truth she barely admitted even to herself. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset while Emma played with wooden blocks at their feet, Yates broached a subject they'd been carefully avoiding. "School starts next month," he said, his eyes on the horizon. "The town will be busier. I imagine your work will pick up." Margaret nodded. "Usually does. More babies tend to arrive in the fall and winter." "Will you still be able to visit?" His question was casual, but she could hear the tension beneath it. "I'll make time," she promised, though perhaps not as often. Yates was quiet for a moment, then turned to look at her directly. "I've been thinking about getting some help around here. Someone to watch Emma when I'm working with the cattle. Maybe help with cooking and cleaning." "That sounds sensible," Margaret agreed, though she felt an unexpected twinge at the idea of someone else caring for Emma. Mrs. Thornton in town might know of a reliable girl looking for work. "I was thinking of someone more permanent," Yates said, his voice carefully neutral. "Someone who already knows Emma and cares for her." Margaret's breath caught as she understood his meaning. "Yates. I know it's forward of me," he continued quickly, "and perhaps too soon. But Emma loves you, Margaret. And so do I. The simple declaration hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at him, this man who had come into her life so unexpectedly, who had shown her that there could be a future beyond the grief she'd carried. "I love Emma too," she said softly, allowing herself to acknowledge at least part of what she felt. "And her father?" Yates asked, a hint of vulnerability in his eyes. Margaret took a deep breath. "Her father has become very important to me." It wasn't quite a declaration of love, but it was as much as she could offer right now. Yates seemed to understand, his expression softening into a smile. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight," he said. "Just for you to think about it. About us. About what we might build together." Before she could respond, Emma crawled over and pulled herself up on Margaret's skirts, offering her a wooden block with a proud grin. "Thank you, sweetheart," Margaret said, accepting the gift with a smile while her mind whirled with possibilities. That night, as Margaret rode back to town under a canopy of stars, she allowed herself to truly consider Yates's unspoken proposal. Marriage had once been her dearest wish, but after losing Thomas, she'd locked that dream away, focusing instead on her work as a midwife. The idea of opening her heart again was frightening, but the thought of walking away from Yates and Emma was somehow more frightening still. Could she be a mother to another woman's child? Could she be a wife to a man who would always carry his first wife in his heart? Was she ready to leave her independent life in town for the isolation of ranch living? But even as these questions tumbled through her mind, Margaret knew she was already imagining that future teaching Emma to read, helping Yates build his ranch into something prosperous, creating a home filled with love and perhaps, someday, more children. The next few weeks passed in a state of heightened awareness. Neither Margaret nor Yates explicitly mentioned his declaration or the possibility of marriage, but it hovered between them, coloring their interactions with new meaning. His hand lingered a little longer when helping her from her horse. She found excuses to touch his arm when they spoke. They both lavished attention on Emma, who was blissfully unaware of the current flowing between the adults in her life. September brought cooler weather and, as Margaret had predicted, a busier schedule. 2 difficult births in 1 week kept her from visiting the Turner homestead, and she was surprised by how much she missed them both. When she finally rode out to the ranch on a crisp Saturday morning, she found Yates repairing the roof of the cabin while Emma napped inside. "There you are," he called down with a smile that warmed her through. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten us." "Never," she replied, dismounting. "It's been a busy week. 2 new babies in town." Yates climbed down from the roof, brushing dust from his hands before approaching her. "Everyone healthy?" "Yes, though the Wilson baby gave us a scare. Came too early. But he's a fighter." She smiled up at him, struck anew by how handsome he was with the sun glinting in his hair. "Like my Emma," he said proudly. "She's standing on her own now. Took her first steps yesterday, holding onto the table." "And I missed it," Margaret said, a touch of sadness in her voice. Yates's expression grew serious. "You wouldn't have to miss those moments if you lived here." It was the closest he'd come to renewing his proposal since that evening on the porch. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "Yates, The sound of Emma crying from inside the cabin interrupted them. Yates held Margaret's gaze for a moment longer, then turned to go inside. "Think about it," he said quietly. "Please." That evening, after a pleasant day spent with Yates and Emma, Margaret prepared to return to town. As she was saddling her horse, Yates approached with Emma in his arms. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small carved wooden heart, polished to a soft shine. "Emma and I made it together. Well, I made it, and she supervised." Margaret took the heart, running her fingers over its smooth surface. "It's beautiful. I've been thinking about what I said before. Yates continued, his voice steady but his eyes revealing his nervousness. About us. About building a life together. Margaret looked up at him, her heart pounding. Yes? I know you have your work in town, your independence. I wouldn't ask you to give that up entirely. He shifted Emma to his other arm, his gaze never leaving Margaret's face. But I believe we could make a good life together, the three of us. Emma needs a mother, yes, but that's not the only reason I'm asking. I've come to care for you, Margaret. More than I thought possible after losing Claire. He paused, taking a deep breath. I'm not asking you to replace her. I wouldn't want that, and neither would you. But I think we could build something new together. Something that honors what we've both lost, but looks forward to what we might gain. Margaret felt tears pricking at her eyes, moved by the sincerity in his voice. Yates, You don't need to answer now, he assured her. Take all the time you need. I just wanted you to know that my feelings haven't changed. If anything, they've grown stronger. Emma chose that moment to reach out for Margaret, nearly tumbling from her father's arms in her eagerness. Margaret took her, holding the baby close and breathing in her sweet scent. I do need a little time, Margaret said finally, looking up at Yates. Not because I don't care for you both, but because this decision would change everything. Yates nodded, understanding in his eyes. We'll be here whenever you're ready. The ride back to town was filled with tumultuous thoughts. By the time Margaret reached her small house on the edge of River's Bend, she'd made no progress in sorting through her feelings. She slept fitfully that night, dreams filled with images of Yates, Emma, and a future she both yearned for and feared. The next morning brought no clarity, but it did bring word that Molly Peterson was in labor with her first child. Grateful for the distraction, Margaret gathered her supplies and headed to the Peterson farm. The labor was long and difficult. By the time a healthy baby girl was born just after midnight, Margaret was exhausted. She stayed until dawn to ensure mother and child were stable, then rode home in the early morning light, her mind too tired for complex thoughts. She slept for a few hours, then woke to the sound of knocking at her door. Bleary-eyed, she opened it to find Sheriff Davis standing on her porch, his expression grave. Miss Jameson, I need you to come with me, he said, without preamble. There's been an accident at the Turner Ranch. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Yates? Emma? Mr. Turner took a bad fall while working on his roof. He's alive but injured. The baby is fine, neighbor lady is watching her. But he's asking for you. Relief that they were both alive was quickly replaced by worry as Margaret grabbed her medical bag and followed the sheriff to his wagon. The ride to the Turner Ranch seemed interminable, though Sheriff Davis pushed the horses as fast as he dared. When they arrived, Margaret found the cabin door open and Mrs. Whitaker, from the neighboring farm, sitting in a rocking chair with Emma. The baby began to cry as soon as she saw Margaret, reaching for her with desperate arms. She's been fussy all morning, poor thing, Mrs. Whitaker said, handing the baby over. He's in the bedroom. Doc Jenkins is with him. Margaret hurried to the small bedroom at the back of the cabin, Emma on her hip. Dr. Jenkins, the town's elderly physician, was bent over the bed where Yates lay, his face pale with pain. Ah, Miss Jameson. Dr. Jenkins straightened as she entered. Good. Mr. Turner has been most insistent about seeing you. Margaret. Yates's voice was strained but clear. His left leg was splinted and a bandage wrapped his forehead. Emma? She's right here, Margaret assured him, moving closer to the bed so he could see his daughter. She's fine. What happened to you? Roof gave way. He grimaced. Stupid mistake. Should have checked the beams more carefully. Dr. Jenkins cleared his throat. Mr. Turner has a broken leg and several cracked ribs, along with a nasty cut on his head. He needs complete bed rest for at least 2 weeks, preferably longer. The leg will take 6 to 8 weeks to heal properly. Margaret looked at Yates in concern. The ranch. Already sent word to the Whitakers. Their boy will help with the cattle for now. Yates reached for her hand, wincing at the movement. But Emma, I can't care for her like this. Mrs. Whitaker has offered to take the child until Mr. Turner recovers, Dr. Jenkins said, packing his bag. It seems the most sensible solution. No, Margaret and Yates said simultaneously. Dr. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. Well, someone needs to care for both the baby and Mr. Turner. He shouldn't be left alone in this condition, and he certainly can't manage an active infant. Margaret looked down at Emma, who had nestled against her shoulder, and then at Yates, whose blue eyes held a mixture of pain and hope. In that moment, the decision she'd been struggling with suddenly became clear. I'll stay, she said firmly. I'll care for them both. Dr. Jenkins looked surprised but nodded. That would be ideal from a medical perspective, if you can arrange it with your other duties. I can, Margaret said with growing certainty. Mrs. Patterson has been assisting me with births. She can handle any emergencies in town while I'm here. After the doctor left, with promises to return in a few days to check on Yates, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, still holding Emma. You don't have to do this, Yates said, though his eyes told her he desperately wanted her to stay. I know, she replied softly. But I want to. It's not how I imagined you coming to stay, he said with a weak smile. Me flat on my back. Useless. Not useless, Margaret corrected him. Just healing. Emma began to fuss, and Margaret stood to attend to her needs. We'll manage just fine, she assured Yates. All three of us. The next 2 weeks established a new rhythm for their unconventional household. Margaret settled into the cabin, setting up a temporary bed for herself in the main room while Yates recovered in the bedroom. She cared for Emma during the day, prepared meals, and tended to Yates's injuries, changing bandages and helping him move when necessary. The physical closeness required for his care broke down the last barriers of reserve between them. Margaret couldn't remain detached while helping him wash or easing him through the pain of his healing ribs. And Yates, for his part, showed a vulnerability that only deepened her feelings for him. In the evenings, after Emma was asleep, they would talk. Sometimes about practical matters, the ranch, her work in town, arrangements for the coming winter. But increasingly about deeper things, their hopes, their fears, their losses, their dreams. I never thought I'd feel this way again, Yates admitted one night as Margaret changed the bandage on his head. The cut was healing well, the bruising around it fading from purple to yellow. After Claire died, I was sure that part of me was gone forever. Margaret's hands stilled momentarily. I felt the same after Thomas. Like that capacity for love had died with him. What changed? Yates asked softly. She met his eyes, allowing him to see the truth in hers. You did. You and Emma. It was as close to a declaration as she'd come, and the joy that spread across Yates's face told her it was enough for now. By the end of the second week, Yates was able to move about the cabin with crutches, though Dr. Jenkins insisted he still needed to rest frequently and avoid any strenuous activity. His increasing mobility meant Margaret could return to town briefly to check on her patients and gather more of her belongings. The trip to town also gave her an opportunity to speak with Reverend Miller about her situation. While no one had directly questioned the propriety of her staying at the Turner Ranch, she was aware that small-town gossip could be harmful. I understand your concern, Miss Jameson, the Reverend said when she explained the circumstances, but I see no impropriety in a medical professional providing care to those in need. Mr. Turner's injury and his status as a single father with an infant create exceptional circumstances. Margaret felt relief at his understanding, though she knew others might not be so charitable in their assessment. Thank you, Reverend. I appreciate your support. As she was leaving the church, Mrs. Thornton, one of the town's most notorious gossips, stopped her. I hear you've taken up residence at the Turner Ranch. she said, her tone deceptively light. How dedicated of you. Margaret straightened her spine. Mr. Turner suffered a serious injury. As the town's midwife, it's my duty to provide care where needed. Of course, Mrs. Hudd. Thornton smiled thinly, though some might wonder if your interest is entirely professional. Rather than denying it, Margaret made a decision. Mr. Turner and his daughter have become dear to me, Mrs. Thornton. I make no secret of that. The older woman's eyes widened at her candor. Well, I suppose at your age, you can't afford to be particular. Margaret smiled, refusing to be baited. On the contrary, I've become quite particular about the kind of man I would consider sharing my life with. Good day, Mrs. Thornton. As she rode back to the ranch that afternoon, Margaret felt lighter than she had in years. The confrontation with Mrs. Thornton had forced her to articulate feelings she'd been hesitant to fully acknowledge, even to herself. She loved Yates Turner and his daughter, and she was ready to build a life with them, regardless of what the gossips might say. When she arrived at the cabin, she found Yates sitting on the porch with Emma on his good leg, reading to her from a tattered book of children's stories. The sight filled her with such tenderness that she paused before dismounting, committing the image to memory. Yates looked up and smiled when he saw her, a smile so full of genuine pleasure that it took her breath away. "Welcome home," he said simply. And Margaret knew with sudden clarity that this was indeed home. Not the physical structure, but wherever Yates and Emma were. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Margaret joined Yates on the porch. The September night was cool, but not cold. The sky ablaze with stars. "How was town?" he asked, making room for her on the bench beside him. "Illuminating," she replied with a small smile. "I had an interesting conversation with Mrs. Thornton." Yates groaned. "That woman could gossip the ears off a cornstalk. What did she have to say?" "She implied that my interest in caring for you might not be entirely professional." Margaret turned to face him, gathering her courage. "I didn't deny it." Yates grew very still. "What did you say?" "I told her that you and Emma have become dear to me." Margaret took a deep breath. "I'm tired of pretending, Yates. I've spent these past months trying to be cautious, trying not to rush into feelings I wasn't sure I was ready for. But life is too uncertain for such caution." She reached for his hand, taking it between both of hers. "When the sheriff came to tell me you were hurt, all I could think was that I might lose you before I ever told you that I love you. I don't want to make that mistake again." Yates's hand tightened around hers, his eyes shining in the starlight. "Margaret, I love you," she continued, the words flowing freely now. "And I love Emma as if she were my own. If your offer still stands, I would like nothing more than to build a life with you both." Yates pulled her closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "It stands," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It will always stand. I love you, Margaret Jameson. You've brought light back into our lives when I thought we'd be in darkness forever." He leaned forward, hesitating just a breath away from her lips. "May I?" In answer, Margaret closed the distance between them, kissing him with all the love she'd kept contained for so long. His lips were warm and gentle against hers, his hand at her waist drawing her closer. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he whispered. "As soon as I can stand at the altar without these blasted crutches. Be my wife. Be Emma's mother." "Yes," Margaret answered without hesitation. "Yes to all of it." 6 weeks later, on a bright November morning, Margaret Jameson became Margaret Turner in a simple ceremony at the Rivers Bend Church. Emma, now nearly 10 months old and taking her first toddling steps, was held by Mrs. Patterson, who dabbed at her eyes throughout the service. Yates stood tall beside Margaret, his leg healed enough to stand without crutches, though he still walked with a slight limp. When Reverend Miller pronounced them husband and wife, the smile that lit Yates's face was radiant with joy and promise. The small reception afterward was held at the Peterson farm, whose barn had been decorated with autumn flowers and ribbons. The townspeople who had once gossiped about the midwife and the widower now offered their congratulations and well wishes. Even Mrs. Thornton approached them, her expression surprisingly genuine. "Well, my dear, it seems you knew what you were about after all," she said to Margaret. "I wish you both every happiness." As the celebration continued around them, Yates pulled Margaret aside for a moment of privacy. "How does it feel to be Mrs. Turner?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "Wonderful," she replied honestly, "though I think I'll still be Miss Jameson to my patients, at least for now." "Of course," he agreed readily. "Your work is part of who you are. I would never ask you to give that up." Margaret leaned into him, grateful beyond words for his understanding. "I was thinking I might set up a proper examining room at the ranch. There are families out our way who could use medical care closer than town." "Our way," Yates repeated with a smile. "I like the sound of that." "I do too," Margaret said, reaching up to touch his cheek. "Our home, our life, our family." "Speaking of family," Yates's expression grew more serious. "I know we haven't discussed this directly, but I hope that someday Emma might have brothers or sisters, if that's something you want as well." Margaret felt her heart swell with love for this man who continued to surprise her with his thoughtfulness. "I would like that very much," she said softly. "A house full of children, if we're blessed that way." The sound of Emma's laughter drew their attention back to the gathering. The baby was being passed from Mrs. Patterson to Dr. Jenkins, her small hands reaching for his spectacles. "We should rescue the good doctor," Yates said with a chuckle. As they moved to rejoin the celebration, Margaret felt a profound sense of rightness settle over her. 6 months ago, she had found a desperate man holding his crying baby, whispering that he didn't know what to do. Now they were a family, bound together by love and choice, rather than simply circumstance. The path ahead would not always be easy, she knew. There would be challenges in blending her work with ranch life, in raising Emma to know about her birth mother while embracing Margaret as her mother too, in weathering the inevitable storms that life would bring. But they would face those challenges together, with the strength that came from finding love when neither had expected it. That night, after the celebration ended and they returned to the ranch to their home, Margaret stood on the porch with Yates, watching the stars while Emma slept peacefully inside. "I never thought I could be this happy again," Yates said, his arm warm around her shoulders. "Thank you for bringing joy back into our lives." "You did the same for me," Margaret replied, turning in his arms to face him. "We saved each other, I think." Yates smiled down at her, love shining in his blue eyes. "And we'll keep doing so every day for the rest of our lives." As his lips met hers in a tender kiss, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be in the arms of the man she loved, with their daughter sleeping nearby, and a future full of promise stretching out before them. 5 years later, the Turner Ranch had grown from a modest homestead into one of the most prosperous properties in the territory. The original cabin had been expanded into a comfortable home with plenty of room for their growing family. Emma, now a spirited 5-year-old with her father's blue eyes and a curious mind, had been joined by 3-year-old twins, Matthew and Mark, and infant daughter Claire, named for the mother Emma would never know, but whose memory was honored in their home. Margaret had indeed set up a proper examining room in an addition to the house, where she provided medical care to neighboring ranches and continued to deliver babies throughout the region. Her reputation had grown, and she occasionally traveled as far as Cheyenne to assist with difficult cases, always returning to the loving embrace of her family. Yates had expanded his cattle operation and added a successful horse breeding program, with Margaret working alongside him when her medical duties allowed. They had hired help now, a young ranch hand who lived in a small cabin nearby, and a housekeeper who came 3 times a week to assist with the children and the endless work of maintaining a busy household. On a warm summer evening, similar to the one when Margaret had first found Yates and Emma so many years before, the Turner family gathered on their expanded porch after supper. The twins were playing a game of chase in the yard, their laughter ringing out in the gathering dusk. Baby Claire slept in a cradle beside Margaret's rocking chair. Her tiny fingers curled around a wooden heart, a smaller version of the one Yates had carved for Margaret years ago. Emma sat on the porch steps, practicing her reading from a primer Margaret had brought her from town. Yates stood leaning against the porch railing, watching his family with undisguised pride and contentment. "Papa," Emma called, looking up from her book. "Miss Patterson at school says I'm the best reader in my class." "That doesn't surprise me one bit," Yates replied with a warm smile. "You get your smarts from your mother." Emma beamed at Margaret. "Mama says I get my stubbornness from you, though." Yates laughed, moving to sit beside his wife. "She might be right about that." As the twilight deepened and the first stars appeared, Yates took Margaret's hand in his. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked softly. "When you found me with Emma?" "Often," Margaret admitted, squeezing his hand. "It was the night everything changed, though I didn't know it then." "I was so lost," Yates said, his voice quiet enough that the children couldn't hear. "I had no idea what I was doing with a baby, with the ranch, with anything. I thought my life was over." "And now?" Margaret asked, though she knew the answer from the contentment that radiated from him. Yates looked around at their children, their home, and finally at her. His eyes filled with the same love she'd come to rely on through the years. "Now I know it was just beginning. We were just beginning." As the twins tired of their game and climbed onto the porch to snuggle against their parents, and Emma abandoned her book to join them, Margaret felt the familiar swell of gratitude that had become part of her daily life. From the darkest moments of grief, both she and Yates had found their way to this, a love that sustained them, children who delighted them, a home they had built together. "I love you," she whispered to her husband as the family gathered close in the soft summer darkness. "And I love you," Yates replied, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Always." In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the stars continued their ancient dance across the Wyoming sky. The Turner family sat together on their porch, bound by love and the shared journey that had begun on a desperate night when a lost man didn't know what to do with his crying baby. And a woman with a healing heart showed him the way forward for both of them.